But I wanted to discuss the dreaded topic, rent control. And maybe we can talk about the history of rent control and why was rent control put into place? I know you were saying in 1990 there was no rent control.
No.
Maybe we can discuss this topic in more detail.
Yeah, so rent control was brought in, it was never in British Columbia until 1973. It was brought in by the NDP very arbitrarily. It was just sort of like, there wasn't even legislation. They just sort of said, from now on, there'll be rent control, affects all units. There was no rentalsman office. They had nothing set up. But this is what the NDP often does. They often make just arbitrary rules all of a sudden. They change the rules of the game on you without any forewarning. And this is something that they just kind of threw out. The next year, they had the bureaucracy in place to run this show where every landlord had to register their rents with the rentalsman. Can you imagine all your apartments, everything else? They had a track. This was a day when there's no real, computers weren't that, had all this paper tracking it all. And it was really bad rent control, actually, because you couldn't raise the rent even if the tenant left, right? So that if the tenant left the premises, you had to rent the rent. The rent was registered with the province. You couldn't change it.
Okay.
And so that NDP government didn't last very long. They only lasted 3 years. In 75, the social credit government came in, and they didn't do anything in the first, it came in December of 75. In 76, they didn't do anything. In 77, they did change the act. And what they did is they exempted all new building from rent control. And they exempted rents over a certain amount. I think it was like $700 or something. That was a big rent back then. And then a couple of years later, they got rid of rent control altogether and just put in a policy of rent review, which was, I think, is a little confusing because it did allow almost any tenant to review a rent if it was excessive. But the arbitrator or the rentalsman office would have to still determine whether it was going to succeed or not. If you applied to them to say, my rent's too high, they would look at it and say, no, we don't have a case. Or they would say, yes, this looks excessive, we're going to have a hearing. And then my favorite day in May of 1983, the province closed down the office of the rentalsman. They abolished it. Beautiful day. Anyhow, so we went the next, 10 years without rent control, or 9 years without any rent control. And, did the sky fall? No. Did all horror break loose? No. Were landlords and tenants reasonable? Yes. Were they adults that could deal with each other? Yes. Were they adults that needed government to step in and say, here's how you guys should, run your affairs? No.
Yeah, just to quickly add to that. So we recently purchased a property in Orlando, Florida, 350 unit apartment building. And they're in Florida, in Orlando, there is no rent control. So the logic here is that we're not going in there if there's older couple living there. We're not going in there increase the rents 30%.
Yeah.
There is a brand that we have to keep in place. There's we want people to want to live in our building, so we're not there increasing rents on people, but we want to have the option open if somebody moves out to increase rents, or if there's a reason to increase rent to do so,
or to give them a better unit to allow for them to upgrade, to pay the premium rent to upgrade to a nicer unit.
Perfect, yeah. Gives choices to the tenants too, right? It gives them. So it was. The NDP came back in 1991. At the end of 91 and 92, they said, we're not going to put in rent control, because by that time everyone understood that rent control was a bad policy. Rent control doesn't work. It's destructive. It hurts tenants more than it helps. It hurts everybody. I mean, it hurts the whole market, the industry. So they came up, they basically duplicated the Quebec model, which is another form of rent review, where a tenant can now challenge a rent, any rent. So there was nobody there to sort of say, yes, no, whatever. It was anything could go into the system. And I don't know if you guys were around in British Columbia in the early 90s or the 90s. When a tenant disputed their rent increase, you had a form to fill out that was like 5 pages long this way, and you had to put in all your costs for the last 12 months.
Oh my goodness.
Now, you couldn't just go to your financial statements, because the 12 months was the 12 months of the tenant's anniversary, not the last calendar year, say, or your fiscal year. So every time a tenant did this, you had to go through there, and you should see the formulas. This gets times by this gets, you had to be a mathematician to figure this thing out. And so landlords were becoming fearful of tenants taking them to arbitration and having to fill out this form. So landlords were just sort of playing it safe and saying, well, maybe just 2% and maybe 2.5% this year and see if that works. And the landlord association at the time, knowing that the NDP was in power, they were going to get rid of this. But they said, we'd rather have a fixed amount. Get rid of this whole thing and just tell us what we can raise it. Not because they like that system, but because it's easier. And so they just said, just say 3% is the maximum, but the government never did. And when the Liberals came in under Gordon Campbell in 2001, made a big mistake. He thought the landlords wanted fixed amounts, so that's what he put in. He put in a fixed amount plus 2%, like inflation plus 2% is a fixed amount, thought landlords, there you go.
Right.
And the landlord associations did not challenge it. They had 18 or 16 years to really fight that and get rid of rent control. I think Campbell would have gotten rid of rent control if he was lobbied hard enough. But the landlord associations did nothing. They accepted the inflation plus 2 as a given, having experienced the 10 years of the NDP before, where it was, pretty onerous. And so it brings us to this point. Of course, the NDP comes back into power, and what do? They take the existing 2% plus inflation, just go to inflation, and then a 2-year rent freeze.